interesting about this project was that we invited the artists with no agenda other than we wanted the artists to work with an audience, some kind of audience group over the course of a year. And we wanted there to be some kind of public outcome, which would be defined by the artists themselves. And it was the kind of project that if you had to write a proposal for a funder, if you had to speak to a patron about funding this, if you had to get an institution to back it, it would have happened because we had no idea what the starting point kind of would be and what the end point would become. The artist looked at his own challenges to do with mobility, and also of his colleagues, and also of kind of the general, well, let's say normal people, let's say everyday citizens. And particularly it was conversations that he had with taxi drivers in London, with people who worked in kebab shops, who were university professors, who were teachers back at home. You know, they were in London as refugees and asylum seekers, but were unable to practice their profession in the UK because of their new status as an asylum seeker, as a migrant. And so the artists wanted to engage with this group who were at actually the forefront of issues to do with immigration crackdown in Europe because of the economic crisis and also because of the rise of right-wing extremism as a result of changes in politics and increasing xenophobia in Europe. And so the Silent University attempted to address and reactivate the knowledge that these migrants possessed as a university professor, as a teacher, as a nurse, and tried to funnel this information into different types of programming. So one of which became a website and a portal to exchange information with, between migrants and also between migrants and communities. The other was a series of silent performances at Tate to actually take the state of silence from being a passive state to an active state, whereas it became more of an activist type of performance, whereby, as a member of the public, you couldn't access this information that only the migrants possessed. Through the website, the actual materials from the migrants and asylum seekers were shared, so you could access it there. In addition to this, there was a library that was created of resource materials that related to issues to do around alternative currencies, silence, modes of learning, and migration. So therefore, the project initiated by this artist became this much larger platform to debate and discuss issues around mobility and to take the silence that is often placed upon migrants and asylum seekers and to turn it into an active state, a state of resistance in a way. It received significant media coverage in the UK and has become its own autonomous knowledge exchange platform. And now the Silent University is in Tinston, Stockholm, which is another city that's facing incredible issues around asylum seekers and migrants. After Stockholm, it's traveling to Berlin and to Paris. So it's been wonderful to kind of initiate this project that's gone on to have its own autonomy and to affect communities much kind of greater beyond us in terms of hospitality and mobility. In closing, I'm just going to say the one huge success story that came out of this project was that one of the participants, who was a migrant and asylum seeker and who had been without the capacity to work for 8 years legally in the UK, received his work permit through this process, through this project, which validated him and his capacity to contribute to society. So where politics failed, contemporary art kind of succeeded. And this project by this artist who could recognize the same issues and challenges created a pathway for this person to actually become part of the greater economy in the UK. So I'm going to shut up there and open myself up to questions when we get to the discussion bit. So I'll pass along.
Thank you, Aaron. Now we're gonna move now to the presentation of Koyo Kouoh.
Okay, hi. It's always a great pleasure for me to be in Brazil. Of course, I thank Solange and the whole staff at Video Brazil for the wonderful work that they do every 2 years in bringing people from virtually all corners of the globe. And as Annalee said, they are doing an amazing work of hospitality. My contribution has no title. I just think that I will run you through 10 or so images that will address the topic of our panel. The contemporary world is characterized by the constant movement and displacement of people, but this is met by the increased unwillingness of countries to welcome migrants. In 2010, I made an exhibition called Make Yourself at Home, Hospitality in a Changing World. You see the invitation to the exhibition back there. And it was an exhibition that had almost 10 artists. The exhibition was looking at the notion of hospitality and how this notion of how this is translated in artistic production and how artists perform hospitality in their works. The exhibition further looked at how artists interpret the concepts of home and hospitality in a globalized world. It featured 10 international artists and artist groups who were all specially commissioned to explore the issues of hospitality at the individual, institutional, or national level, to touch on themes such as human migration, colonial heritage, and international conflict. The show was first held in Copenhagen at Kunsthal Charlottenburg. I don't know, Denmark markets itself as the happy and cozy country. It's the country of happiness, it's a country of felicity. However, it is also one of the European countries that has the harshest laws to control migration and mobility. In paradox to it, it is as well the country that has one of the most generous cultural policies to promote international artistic exchange, research, and circulation. So the ambiguity and unease that underline these kinds of ideals have long been analyzed by different thinkers. Derrida, for instance, describes the phrase "make yourself at home," which I actually took from his reading, as a self-limiting invitation. That basically means, please feel at home, but remember that this is not your home and this is not your place, and you should respect my rules and leave eventually. The next. This is a work by Belgian artist Philippe Aguirre Iotegi, a Belgian sculptor. And I think the work symbolizes, portrays very clearly the nomadic nature of art professionals and mainly artists that nowadays work in trans, meta, and multiple places at the same time. But it's a complex and sometimes double-edged nature of hospitality informs art a lot. The next, view is a commissioned work that by Danish artist collective, artist group, Wulu, whose work entirely is based on dealing and performing and translating the idea of hospitality and migration and the very difficulty of a globalized world in limiting human circulation. This is a project, Wulu, that they did in the host book that you see there. During the first climate conference in Copenhagen in, when was it, 2009, December 2009, there were, the official delegation, of course, were all representing established and recognized institutions, were in a totally set environments and through very established channels, and all the environmental activists coming from all the world countries could not, first of all, had a lot of difficulties in attending the conference. Maybe it was made on purpose so that they don't cause trouble. And if they made it to Copenhagen, it was absolutely impossible for them to house themselves or to find affordable hotels. So Wulu, knowing that and working with that difficult material, which is actually also non-physical, and this is why I really like the work of this artist group, they started a wide range, I mean a city-wide and metropolitan area of Copenhagen-wide program of developing hospitality through the local inhabitants. So you could sign up as a resident of Copenhagen or the surroundings to be part of this project. And the idea was to allow and make your home available for these artists, for these activists, environmental activists coming from Brazil, from Africa, from wherever, who could not afford to pay these high rates in the hotels in Copenhagen. So, and it was an amazing success because this project actually showed that government policies and UN policies do absolutely not match the people's desires, be them the local residents of Copenhagen who were absolutely open to open their homes to these visitors. So, I mean, the greatest paradox of our era is that we can move, hello?
Hello, hello.
Okay. That we can move from one hemisphere to another in 12 hours, but the borders become more and more difficult to cross, more close, and they are going to be more and more locked in the future, and especially for certain people coming from certain regions of the world. At the same time, the West is spreading its images, its culture, its way of thinking via a rich diversity of channels, attracting people from less industrialized countries who want to live that fantasized life. So artistic exchange plays an important role in this mix. Next image. Thank you. So it happens more than often that we imagine that an artist or any other art professional is granted a residency or is officially invited for an exhibition or meeting by an established and recognized organization, but cannot travel due to conflicting processes of getting a visa. The visa offices establish a climate of suspicion and not one of trust and respect. Any visa applicant is first and foremost a potential migrant. This attitude is not limited to Western chancelleries only. Even, for instance, in Africa, the intracontinental mobility is just as difficult given the ineffectiveness of the agreements passed between the different regions of the continent. So for instance, a Cameroonian would need a visa to come to Senegal, a Kenyan would need a visa to come to Senegal, a Senegalese would need a visa to go to South Africa, which is absolutely ridiculous in my point of view. And this is the case especially when traveling on land on itinerant artistic projects. This situation also have an influence in the elaboration of artistic programs, as some institutions try to avoid the difficulty of arranging visas by favoring professionals who do not need a visa to travel. I live in a country that markets itself as the country of hospitality, the famous Senegalese teranga. Teranga is a Wolof word. It's actually a bag word that can really translate into openness, hospitality, welcome, conviviality. Yet instead of following that tradition of welcome and openness, Senegal has just recently established a visa rule for anyone wanting to enter the country. I mean, some people applauded this because it was seen as abiding to the concept of reciprocity by applying the same conditions to particularly Western and American travelers. However, I believe that the only outcome of this new measure is that it will bring fresh money into the state's account. A big part of it will probably land in the pockets of the electronic company operating the system and the officials affiliated at the Ministry of Tourism and Interior. That said, I want to tell you a little story about how raw material came about and how we consider and how we work with residency. So some of you may be familiar with Dakar. It is a mythical city shaped by Léopold Sédar Senghor's utopias of universalism and métissage. It is considered the cultural capital of Africa. And indeed, it is hard to resist its urban charm. Located at the most western point of Africa, directly facing Brazil, in fact, Dakar has been the site of landmarking cultural events since the 1960s, beginning with the historical first Festival of Negro Arts, Festival Mondial des Arts Nègres, which, for the time, brought together leading professionals, artists, writers, musicians, thinkers, from Africa and its diaspora. The Dakar edition of 1966 has never been rivaled ever since, despite the edition of the festival in 1977 in Lagos and in 2010 in Dakar, which for my part are considered generally failures in the professional community. Later on, the government of Senegal established the Dakar Biennial in 1992. Dakar can therefore boast of a relative dynamism in terms of artistic action and intellectual production, if one measures this by the number of exhibitions or the existence of a biennial. However, the public landscape of intellectual exchange and confrontation and production was like this. And it was very odd for me to realize that a place as mythical as Dakar did not have a single independently or public space that addresses theoretical ideas around contemporary artistic production. So it was no longer acceptable for me to complain about the inefficiency of the biennial and the fact that nothing happens in It was not any more sustainable to be apologetic towards international visitors about the lack of resources and facilities, even though I did not want to open a space, I literally had to. I had no choice. So we went from this to that. So Raw Material Company was born out of that necessity to create a space for knowledge sharing. The core motivation was to establish a space for alternative education and learning. That was really the first drive to establish Raw Material Company. A place that would provide access to contemporary artistic theory on the one hand, and in return produce discourse, ideas. No, it's me. I hate electronic things. So a place that will provide access to contemporary artistic theory on the one hand, and in return produce discourse, ideas, and practices with an emphasis on Africa and Africa-related matters primarily, but also to a broader range of origins and intellectual schools. So, the name raw material refers to Africa as the traditional provider of raw materials for international industry. It also refers to art and intellectualism as a raw material for human development. Company stands for our entrepreneurial approach to artistic production, as well as for a collaborative sense of togetherness. I started by donating my personal library of art books and video collection. Our program is an integrated one. This is a view of one of our residency suites. So I started by donating my personal collection of books and video collection. Our program is integrated. It uses multiple formats of artistic interventions through exhibitions, residency, publication, and discursive activities such as talks, symposia, and panel discussions. One of the core motivation in setting up Raw Material was to be able to develop a financial independence also to sustain ourselves. So you have a view here of how one of the residency looks like. Our residency program is a very particular one. It's not really open while it's open. What I mean is that we do not accept applications, and we identify ourselves which artists or professionals we want to work with. And that is not necessarily linked to our current program, but that is more linked to the needs of the artists and also the ideas that we are developing around certain issues. So, beyond we therefore run a bar and a restaurant where we do slow food and local Pan-African cuisine. We also use cuisine and food, and I was hearing Aaron talking about politics of food, and I actually already researched on the Delfina website about it, because food is also one of our main tool of operating. So you have a view here of the library, which is actually an open library, on-site consultation library. I don't really know how many volumes that we have. This was an image in the very, very early opening days of Raw Material Company. It's totally full now. And we have a kind of a collection of a lot of books, of course, of exhibitions, because one of our main activities is really also promoting curatorial practice, and a lot of artist books and a lot of a wide collection on art politics, theory, art history, magazines, and so on. Yeah, I'm almost there. So, in terms of, to go back to our residency program, our residencies are really sporadic and self-directed. What does that actually mean? It means that we, as I said, we do not accept application, we do not look for funding. They are the results of encounters that arise naturally and develop organically in pursuit of a aim that we usually do not know in advance. So beyond the general activities, whenever we invite someone to come to do a residency at Raw Material Company, it's always the result of a long process of, of discussion, of conversation, of exchange that happened between the professional and the organization. So And also, we don't want the application process because we are still testing the different kind of ways in which we would want or we could run a residency program. And that's one. The other thing is also that we cannot, we are such a small team. It may sound absolutely amazing from afar, but only 2.5 people work at raw material companies. So we can absolutely not afford the responsibility of reviewing applications and eventually having to tell to certain people, oh no, we cannot take you. So, and this is also one of the reasons that, and that our residencies are very flexible in the sense that they are not only addressed to artists, they are also addressed to architects, for instance, urban planners, we've had writers, curators, and so on. And it can be residency from 1 week to 6 months, depending on what people are working on, what they are coming for, and also what kind of benefit we also get from the resident being in Senegal. The only thing that is quite regular and clear is that any resident that is passing through raw material has to do a public program. That's the only production kind of criteria that we have. And the public program is mostly a talk, a presentation, and it's also a way to connect the visitor, the resident, to the local community, to introduce, to expose his work and his ideas or her ideas to the local community, and so create a kind of, build more knowledge and create a relationship. So beyond the general activities of getting logistically settled, residents are pretty much on their own. This is why we can only work with mature professionals who are savvy about what they do and who do not require too much support from us. Nevertheless, since we work on site on a daily basis, the residents have access to staff from Monday to Saturday from 10 to 7. When I say that mature professionals, I mean, we have had the experience a lot, be it within raw material company or in other contexts, is that people come to Africa and they are overwhelmed. So, and you spend time, you know, getting through that process of getting people up to speed. And this is also why the process of who we are inviting or who is coming is a long process for people that are really, they know that in advance that they are coming in a challenging environment and that they should be prepared to, you know, to meet those challenges. And the space is actually extremely small, and you have here a view of the gallery space downstairs, which is also accessible, of course, to the resident, depending on what we have on. Actually, the thing is that we have a very, very tightly curated exhibition program that is extremely full. So using the gallery space is usually only possible in between exhibitions if the work of the resident is not the subject of the exhibition, for instance. Next. This is, you have an installation view of our current exhibition, which is an exhibition that we did basically only to launch the monograph that we just published about Issa Sam, which is one of the seminal Senegalese artists of generation of the late 1960s. Next. Yeah, another installation view. So, I mean, I'll stop here. I'm sure you have a lot of comments and questions, and I know Amilcar is already. And yeah, of course, this comes at the end, but it's not the least. We have the privilege to live in a climate where it is mostly nice year around. So we run this bar and restaurant, which is everything is on site and it's also accessible to the resident. But of course, they also have their own quarters with their own kitchen and so on. But this is also for us not only a format of curatorial work, but also a space for converging and, performing hospitality. Thank you.
Thank you, Koyo. Eu vou talvez mudar para o inglês porque talvez seja melhor com os nossos convidados assim, não? So we're running out of time, so I'm just going to briefly point some things and open the panel for discussions. But things that I was thinking rather when the three of our guests were speaking is that those kind of initiatives, they are places to inhabit rather than places to see things. They build public spaces rather than be places where we are put in the position of being public, I mean audiences. Places of co-responsibility, of creating an economy, places that are producing and building other economies, that are looking for developing systems of sustainability related to local context, rather a how than a what, interventions in the real. It is not about reproducing institutions, but about producing other kinds of institutions. Which borders are we facing now? Because not only the physical geopolitical borders we face, but other kind of borders. Personal engagement, singular responses to local context, transdisciplinary or better, indisciplinary practices. So please, if anyone has a comment, would like to make a question, it's open to you.
Good morning. No, my question is not so much about geographical borders, but more about conceptual borders, sort of thinking frameworks. And the question that I probably would like to ask you is, to what extent do you feel that, for example, looking at the tradition of modernism, European tradition of modernism, to what extent do you feel that artists from elsewhere are able to play with that tradition in a way?
You said issues of what? Sorry, I couldn't actually. You said modernism or
yes,
migration?
No.
Yeah.
I was. Yeah. We were talking about geography, but what I'm really concerned is about the question of thinking frameworks.
Yeah.
And looking at the history of Western modernism. Yeah. And what I'm actually quite interested in is the way artists from elsewhere adapt, perverse, whatever, use that tradition in their own practice. And I actually just wanted to have your idea on that, and to what extent artists now can do that, being from elsewhere, and play with that.
Wow, I'm not exactly sure how to answer that question, other than to say that, in the context of Delphina Foundation, to speak kind of personally about it, we provide a context for artists to simply do what they want to do. We kind of create bespoke programs around that. We have worked with institutions who look specifically at these issues. And I think if you talk about modernism, like right now we could look at an institution like kind of Tate Modern, who in particular, are now collecting artists from the Middle East and North Africa to fill holes within their own kind of collection, where they haven't taken on board the idea of kind of Arab modernism, although there was artists who were alongside all the international contemporaries that are currently hanging in Tate, producing work in Lebanon, in Cairo, in other places. So I'm not really sure how to answer your question, other than to say that I think there is scope for it now. There is an interest in terms of audiences and also curators in engaging in the region in that particular way. And there are interests from artists because at the moment, the artists who have worked around kind of modernism from the Arab world are beginning to gain more of a profile. And actually, if you look at the acquisitions from sort of Tate, kind of Guggenheim, they're starting with kind of the quote-unquote Arab masters, if I could call them that, before they actually collect the contemporary artists. So I haven't really answered your question, I'm sorry, but I think it's probably a longer discussion to unpick what you mean.
For us, the issue really is more about generating awareness of what's happening within our own region, because very often our artists have a better understanding of what's going on in New York or London than they do within the region. And one of the things I brought to share is a publication called ARC, which is actually trying to deal with that. It's trying to create knowledge about Caribbean production. So that really is a larger issue for us. How do we get to know about ourselves? And the internet actually has begun to change everything and is making that kind of access to information more possible.
Well, I mean, from the perspective of raw material company, for instance, I think personally, I am interested, or I was interested in the role or in the division public-private, especially in former French colonies, which and how that those countries, what kind of systems and programs they have developed to take care of arts and culture. And it turns out that there is not only a cultural heritage and a colonial political heritage, there is also an administrative heritage. So what I mean by that is that in a lot of former French colonies, there is this amazing presence of the state trying to organize everything. And the cultural policies are developed by civil servants who are not always necessarily knowledgeable and professional in what they are dealing with. So it creates, on the one hand, a kind of impression that a lot is being done because there are a lot of initiatives that are being launched and implemented. And, but at the same time, you have a local audience and even an international audience of professionals, artists, writers, curators, who were constantly, you know, complaining about the situation. So in terms of creating, our border is really between public and private. And it's also a critique of the super powerful state that wants to control everything, but at the end doesn't really produce a lot of meaning. So this is where we place ourselves. And the formats that we are using, I think that you cannot reinvent the wheel. I mean, contemporary art is in itself a geography. It's a territory in itself. It's and has developed a language of its own. So whoever enters that territory learns those languages. You can create a few more or a few more kind of words to enrich that language, but the basic language is the language of contemporary art. If you apply it in Kuala Lumpur or in Recife. So I really, I don't think that there is an Asian way or European way or an African way of dealing with contemporary art. There is contemporary art, and that is the territory, and that is the matrix that we work with.
I have a question that follows up on this a little bit, but it has to do with language. It's this kind of reified language that Aaron brought up about sort of nonprofit speak. And I wonder if you could expand a little bit more on what you meant by the role of residencies in papering over certain kinds of functions that should be elsewhere. I wasn't clear on where you're going with that.
Yeah, sure. I was specifically just talking about the agendas that come often with funding to smaller organizations, and some of those agendas being heavily dictated by government and by kind of political agendas, which may preference some kind of exchange between certain countries. So right now, even in the UK, which is not even a political thing, but there is more interest from public bodies to fund projects between the UK and Brazil just because the Olympics happen, kind of, for example. And then if you look at what happened in the Middle East and North Africa over the last kind of 2-3 years and all the quote-unquote revolutions, whatever one wants to call them, a lot of funding went into the region. From the UK specifically, something called the Arab Partnership kind of fund. And then also within the region itself, there were funding available for artists to create work about kind of the revolution. And so what I was meaning about, I was meaning more about kind of agendas that comes with funding, but often in the context of residency specifically, that type of funding can be used to facilitate exchange between two countries that at a grassroots level where it isn't happening at the highest level. Another examples like Iran, for example, and I'll stop here, but the British Council, for example, was kicked out of Iran 3 or 4 years ago, but yet and still supporting arts organizations to do work between Iran and the UK because they themselves couldn't have a presence, as it were. So then arts can be used to kind of paper over diplomatic cracks.
So cultural diplomacy, right?
In a way, yes.
I wonder if anybody else had a response to that role of the nonprofit that you play that's negotiated with the government, and whether you see yourself supplementing or transgressing it in some way.
One of the issues with working with our government is that any funding that's available is always national. There's a national agenda, and we have a very regional agenda. So there's a little bit of a, there's some restrictions functioning there. What we're actually trying to do at Fresh Milk is to sit down at the table with members from the government and from the private sector, because everybody's functioning in their separate silos. And as much as that may feel like a very foreign territory, because the state is lagging behind in many ways for what our needs are, my thinking is that we have to sit down at the table and have conversations and begin to explain what our needs are, how can we begin to develop partnerships so that can hopefully have some spin-off. So the project we did here in May also developed an itinerary for people from the Ministry of Culture to come in and have a sensitization to the contemporary scene in Sao Paulo. Hopefully then they would begin to understand how a space like this functions and then more better understand how we're trying to work. So it's really trying to build relationships, not just with artists, but with people that are writing policy and crafting legislation who don't understand what our needs are. We have to sit at the table and have those conversations as much as we don't necessarily want to.
Which is also maybe like the territory that you were saying, no? I think that how you negotiate and how do you define your battleground? No?
But also the language that's used too, because again, we're using our own language over here, and actually politicians may not necessarily understand what a residency is. For example, if you turn up at the UK border and say you're here for a residency, they're going to put you in a room for a few hours. If you say you're here for a cultural exchange project, they understand that. So how we actually translate what we do and the outcomes and the possible benefits of it, is really, really important. It's something that we need to constantly be aware of.
Hi, my question is for Koyo. I recently heard a Beninese artist, Homo Al-Hazoume, and another artist, Jelly from Mali, Toumani Kouyaté, and they were both very critical about Francophone's artistic scene because they depend mainly upon money from French institute and things like that. So how to deal with this sort of dependence of some Francophone Africa on this kind of Institut Français and things like that?
Well, raw material doesn't depend on Institut Français, and I'm very proud to say that. Even though, but I totally hear it. I mean, and this is what I was sort of briefly hinting at in the introduction, is that we are a very hybrid organization. I mean, we call ourselves non-profit, but at the same time, the work, whenever we can sell work, we do sell it, because we also do, one of our aim is also to provide livelihood for artists. And the market is so non-existent anyway that you have to find kind of polyvalent hybrid systems of sustaining yourself. So that's why we run a restaurant and a bar, not only because of the fact that the tool of a bar and the restaurant is a very important tool in my curatorial practice and in how I conceive spaces of artistic presentation and artistic exchange, but also in order to have a certain financial credibility or financial independence that makes us less at risk or less exposed to funding agencies. But after all, we are doing a work within a context that does not really have many channels of funding. Of course, we are independent only intellectually, but financially we are totally dependent on international funding, or sometimes since we exist, Raw Material Company was established in 2011, and I'm very proud to say that we have this kind of force and power because I put a lot of time into securing this independence. So, for instance, half of the funding of Raw Material Company comes from my work. Comes from my pocket, basically. My curatorial assignments and so on. And from my husband and from my father. So, and the other part of it comes a little bit from selling alcohol and food. And another part of it comes, of course, we need funding organizations. But to come back to what Abdoulaye and Romuald told you, and this is also why an organization like Raw Material Company exists in Dakar, is that's true. The former French colonies in West Africa, in Central Africa, have adopted the French way of dealing with the arts, and also, which has its positive sides, but we experience a lot the downsides of it. The downsides of it is that things have not critically framed. They are very much philosophical. French theory is pervading the whole contemporary art, critical analysis, but at the same time, it's a way of doing that does not really promote independent initiative or private initiative, and I'm absolutely not afraid to say it publicly. I'm one of those advocates against that kind of regime, and I've refused French funding for many times because of these kind of systems. So, and I really think that we just published actually a very interesting publication that deals exactly with some of those topics, because it's the result of a symposium that Raw Material organized 1.5 years ago, looking at the changing landscape of independent art institutions in Africa. So, and one of the subjects of the symposium was actually, one of the panel of the symposium was the question, what are you doing here? And it was addressed to the foreign cultural institutions such as the Goethe, the Institut Français, and so on, British Council, who have an extremely strong hold in, not only in Africa, even here in Brazil and at other places, and also have different policies. And I'm internationally considered as that one who doesn't really work with the French, but that's nothing against France per se, but it's just against the policy that they apply to Africa specifically, which I think is very problematic. It's still extremely colonialized and demands a critical opposition to it. So, but we depend on funding. I mean, Raw Material Company is part of the Arts Collaboratory Network, and we couldn't start our activities, for instance, without the kind of seed funding of Arts Collaboratory. We are a cooperation partner of Goethe, and we also work. I mean, we establish collaborations with institutions around projects that, in a certain way, not only feed the different formats of our work through exhibition, through publications, and so on, but also sort of generate income for the organization. Yeah.
I'm gonna have, unfortunately, maybe just one last question. Afterwards, we're gonna have to stop because we're gonna have to come back here at 2 for the next panel. But at 2, no?
I'm just very.
Hey.
I just want to speak very
3.
quickly.
Sorry.
Some of the speakers know me. I run a residency program in New York called Residency Unlimited, which is very small, and it's not because you're in New York City that you get more funding. That's one thing. We have developed, very kind of creative ways of getting funding. For example, we do exchange of services, like a barter system. So we partner with different organizations and we do exchange of services. So there's no money involved, but exchange of services. And the other thing, I just want to finalize your points, which are very relevant, and that is that we have less funding, it's much more difficult, et cetera, but on the other hand, we have an independence that is really priceless as a small organization that, is not entirely dependent on these institutional funding channels, basically. And I think that today, as Erin was saying, with the shrinking of international funding, one has to be creative, because otherwise, as an independent art organization, basically, you're not going to be able to continue. So it's actually not it's very difficult, but on the other hand, it's more interesting and potentially, I think, perhaps we're at a kind of a transitional phase for the next generation of independent art organizations for whom the finding funding will really be, identifying funding channels will be completely different, basically.
I just wanted to kind of just add to that, almost to reiterate what I said before too. Being independent is about choosing your dependencies as well, and knowing kind of why and what the relationship is between those you become kind of dependent on. And that's a huge advantage to have that kind of autonomy. I mean, not all of us will always have that choice kind of to make. Obviously, Annalee does not have a salary, when she's running this space and giving so much time. And I'm sure it's with many of you in the room, Maria here, who's from Phosphorus, who we did a visit to yesterday, who's dealing with these challenges kind of here in Brazil. But we need to create more platforms so we can actually share information and ideas as small organizations. I think that's what would be important to kind of come out of this panel, actually.
I think that also something which is really, really relevant is how we need continuously to reformulate these things. Like, for instance, rather than thinking about independency, it's about autonomy, I would say, which is chosen, rather maybe than talking about independency, because I believe we are all codependent, it's much more about autonomy. So in that sense, what do we choose to be dependent on? No, and also not giving up of public money, but also being part of the construction of the policies of how public money could be used also, no? And also this idea, it seems that all the time everyone can have money and win money except like self and autonomous initiatives, because it's bad to receive money somehow. And I think that we too fast easily misunderstand and think that to make profit means to speculate on financial money, and of course we all need money somehow to survive in the world that we live. It's a given, no? It's, as you were saying, we're not reinventing the wheel or something like this. There are some pre-established rules, but still we can rethink or re-put or reposition some kind of producing economy, or which kind of economy and labor relations we are creating in somehow. Just to add something, and then we're done, and just to say, there are some flyers here and printed material regarding some of the initiatives, if you would like to take them afterwards. And it's going to be at 3, no? Not at 2:30.
Just to, complete that thought, it's, this is also why, we call ourselves a not-for-profit, and sometimes we are, quote-unquote, attacked because we run a gallery activity that sells, and I always have to educate people, telling them that non-profit doesn't mean that I don't generate income. And the income that I generate is to support exactly what does not sustain the activity financially. So for us, it's really like key. It's that we stay in a kind of a hybrid financial system that consists of being creative. For instance, we just launched a fair in London, and our raw material is part of it, and it's also a kind of indirect way to sustain artists, and to provide financial credibility not only to the works but also to an entire territory that is usually not seen through those lenses. So, and I really think that it's quite hypocritical from a lot of colleagues in the field when it comes to money. Art has always been related to money. Art is always close to money in a sense or in another. So. And there should not be any shame to, even if you make money, I would wish we could make money, we'll be totally independent, I don't think it's a pride, it's a pride to say that, we don't have anything to deal with money. It's rather a sign of, not being economically savvy.
American nonprofits, by the way, American nonprofits sell works. There's nothing shameful about it. It's completely accepted as a way of getting money.
Can I just say, Amilcar, there's a new model developing called For Benefit, which I don't know very much about. I think it's coming out of Europe, but it's allowing nonprofits to kind of straddle that space a bit more. And maybe that's a third model that we need to learn something about, For Benefit.
Well, thank you, Annalee, Aaron, Koyo, thank you guys, and see you later.
Obrigada, Amilcar. Obrigada aos nossos parceiros, Koyo, Aaron, Annalee. A gente tem uma mesa agora, a gente continua a discussão com alguns dos nossos parceiros de residência, com a curadora Gabriela Salgado, a transnacionalidade como horizonte. Seria agora às 2h, mas a gente vai atrasar uma meia hora, então 2h30 aqui no Galpão. Conto com a presença de vocês. Obrigada.